they will have their very lives tomorrow. Lord, hear our prayer. For those who have friends and family in Ukraine, Lord, hear our prayer. For those who've already been killed by violence, for the protesters who seek peace and are asking for the violence to cease, for those of us glued to the news channel and newspapers and witness this violence, Lord, hear our prayer. God, you alone are the one who holds us. You alone are the one who can quiet our minds when all we feel is fear. We ask you that you might hold our fear now. As we don't know what will happen next in our ever-changing world, we ask for you to be a balm to our aching hearts until the day when all we feel is your abiding peace. Amen. So there are a lot of good things about Jennifer, not least of which is that she is Doogie's beautician. He never looks better than when he comes home from Love for Dogs, which is in Glencoe, not too far from Binny's, which I also know pretty well. And I was there the other day doing a touch-up for Doogie. He had some knots behind his ears, and Jennifer's wonderful assistants were working on him, and she says, "What are we doing for Ukraine?" And then she says, I was there. I lived there. I'll let her tell you about that. But so we just threw this together from Thursday. So I'm really glad y'all have come here. Jennifer, thank you for being here. She's not only the best dog groomer in town, but also a spectacular history teacher. And I am going to let Jennifer invite or introduce her friend whenever it's appropriate. Jennifer and Christine will introduce Hillary, our third speaker tonight. Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead now? Okay.
So yes, we are blessed at Kenilworth Union Church to have so many gifted members, and Bill and Katie and I were discussing, what might be an agency that we could recommend to people who were asking about a response to Ukraine and a way to donate. And immediately I thought of Hillary Scott, who is the regional board president of UNICEF for the Midwest region. I hope I got that mostly correct. But I had the privilege of talking to Hillary last summer when we talked a lot about UNICEF, and I knew how knowledgeable she was, and she's going to share with you some of the on-the-ground response that is happening. Before I turn the mic over to you, Jennifer, I'd just like to say for those of you who are online, if you will do questions at the end, and so if you have a question, you can type it in the chat if you're on YouTube, and I will relay those to the speakers. So thank you all for being here. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate belonging to a church that does this kind of stuff, that we really care. I love Kenilworth Union. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to have this conversation, and I hope it leads to more. And I'm very grateful to my friend Kateryna, who's our role star this evening. She is a Ukrainian who has lived here in Chicago for 10 years almost? Yeah. But her family is still in Ukraine. And she worked for me at Love for Dogs, and that's how I got to meet her. So we were really glad that she's here. So I did teach before I did the dog grooming shop as a retirement project. I actually did teach high school history for almost the better part of 3 decades. I have a master's degree in history from Illinois State, and I did my undergraduate double major in religion and history at SMU. And part of what happened to me when I was at SMU, going to college in the late 70s, is that if you'll remember 1978, 79, and you guys, those of us that have the more gray hairs in our temples, we remember that this was the height of the Cold War. Yuri Andropov was the dictator of the Soviet Union. And there was just the beginnings, because there was, there'd been a couple of decades of peace, sort of quasi-peace, since the end of World War II. And, Vietnam had kind of ended and gone away too, those proxy wars. And so there was the beginnings of some cultural exchanges that were happening. And there was it actually started with Life magazine. If you guys remember Life magazine, they started publishing a Russian language version of Life magazine, and it was distributed there, and they in turn printed Soviet Life, and it distributed here in English, and that was part of these exchanges. And then there was a professorial exchange at some of the universities, and Professor Ilya Mamontov from Latvia, which was part of the Soviet Union at that time, came as a guest lecturing professor to Southern Methodist University's history department, where I was. And then he got permission to do something that had never been done, at least, not that anybody could remember, and take a group of American college students on an exchange program for a semester. And I was a part of that group, 10 students that got to go to the Soviet Union. And there I am. That's me 44 years ago, right there in the center. See how young I was? Right. I picked out a couple of the pictures. I actually brought my scrapbook. It's over here. But one of the things I was really interested in studying there, because I was double majoring in history and religion, this is one of my most prized possessions. This is my Ukrainian medieval Orthodox Church artwork. And I pass this book around, or I'll just leave it out for people to look at. It's just really, you should look at it, Kateryna. It's beautiful. And I went there really primarily to study iconostasis and how you read the walls of an Orthodox church, and it was quite fascinating to me. I also was in Ukraine, so we did 3 cities. We were briefly in Helsinki, Moscow, Leningrad, and Kyiv, and I was in Kyiv for, almost, 6 weeks, I guess, and I actually got a sort of a boyfriend, and that's him in the upper right-hand corner. I got my eyes shut. I look silly, bad cameras in those days, but that's George, or Jorge. And anyway, George was really my window to Ukraine. We talked endlessly about politics and history and culture and what did they think about being an occupied people, being forcibly part of the Soviet Union, and we had long conversations about that. One of the things, and I think this is St. Michael's, isn't it, Kateryna? It's one of my I think it's in Kyiv. It's one of my favorite churches. But I also remember very distinctly, one of the most vivid parts of this trip 44 years ago for me was all of the places that they showed us where there had been damage and destruction during World War II. They showed us these bombed out churches and these bombed out buildings that still in the 70s were still there in piles of rubble. And there was a very high consciousness for being victims of Hitler and their sense of being victims of genocide. And one of the reasons why I'm absolutely positive Putin is using this, let's go get the Nazis in Ukraine, which of course is malarkey, but he's using that because that's a huge push button issue for Ukrainian people and for Russian people. And in fact, I think one of the most moving places that I visited was this mass burial site outside of what is now St. Petersburg. At that time was Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad was from 1942 to 1945, 3 years that the people in that city were trapped by the Nazis and surrounded, and they were unable to get food, water in. People starved to death. They resorted to cannibalism and all sorts of horror stories. 1.5 million people died in one city because they were just cut off and surrounded. And there's a mass burial site outside of Leningrad. And Vladimir Putin's baby brother, they were both little, but his baby brother died in the siege of Leningrad. And so they are very much conscious constantly. This was a high thing on their their consciousness about being secure and never having anybody ever be able to attack them again. And I just wanted to sort of call attention to that. Was really stood out for me. But as a longtime high school history and geography teacher, one of the things that I have come to understand about this whole, maybe it's all global, maybe it's not just even Russia, that there's something about being a really big gigantic in size nation that seems to lend itself towards totalitarian government. And I'm beginning to think that it is almost driven by the size of what they were having to govern. Russia is the largest country in the world. It is 11% of the world in one country. And it's like bigger by far than anything else. And it has had a long series of totalitarian leaders. And I'm beginning to really wonder if it isn't sort of inevitable that leadership in these kinds of countries become totalitarian just because management requires it. But I do know this. When I was a history and religious studies major in college, I definitely learned one thing to be a great thing to be true about history, and that is that geography is the mother of history. And I got this phrase from this wonderful African professor, Professor Mazrui, I hope I'm saying his name right. He's from University of Michigan. And I saw an African documentary that he did and learned that when he taught us about the relationship between geography and history, I thought that that's what I would share with you a little bit tonight, just to give a background to what you're going to hear going on in Ukraine today. So just to start, little geography. Russia is the Earth's largest nation. It is 11% of the world in one country. And as you can see, it is very cold and Arctic. It basically resides, a lot of it, inside the Arctic Circle. And it covers... basically, it wraps from Alaska. It literally is only 4 miles from Alaska at one point, all the way around to Europe and the North Atlantic. It completely spans 2 continents, both Europe and Asia. And they do have a problem. They have a warm water port problem. I'm going to grab, what did I do with my water? So... they have cold weather. Cold weather keeps them from being able to ship things, but they have an enormous economy. But you'll see their only warm water port is down near the Black Sea, which is in the southern part of the country. It's the only place in the whole country where they can get things out to the rest of the world year round. Okay. Otherwise, they're very much ice locked. So Russia does export significantly around the world. Their 2 largest crops are exporting are wheat, grain. They supply much of the world's grain. They are the number 1 supplier of. That's why they call Russia and Ukraine. They call it the breadbasket of the world. And they are huge exporters of wheat and grain. And they are also, obviously, we've been hearing a lot of this in the news, huge exporters of energy, and particularly oil. But to get it out, they really have only one way to get it out. And that's through the warm water ports of the Black Sea. Well, they actually go down to the Sea of Azov, which then goes down into the Black Sea, which then goes through the Bosphorus at Istanbul, which the Straits of the Bosphorus in Istanbul is an extremely narrow and one of the most critical waterways in the world. It's like the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal and the Bosphorus in Istanbul. And those are like the 3 most critical waterways in the world, because you can't get anything anywhere up into Asia or any of those other locations unless you go through those straits. So, and you can see where Ukraine is located, and the Crimea, which is a peninsula, which has always been part of Ukraine, but that this is Putin took Crimea in 2014. He just took it. Said, sorry, we need that. So Russia as a country that is both in Europe and in Asia, I just wanted to show you the location of a couple things. This is actually Russia's European borders right now. This little blue thing up here that looks like it's not attached to it, that's part of Russia. It's Kaliningrad. It was a compromise after World War II. The Germans had it. Hitler, this was all part of the settlement between the USA, the USSR, and Great Britain at the end of World War II, who was going to get what. They divided up Germany, all of those things. So this Kaliningrad is actually part of Russia. And then you have all of these other very critical neighbors. Belarus, or White Russia is what it used to be called. Belarus is actually run by currently a puppet dictator friend of Putin's. I mean, the guy he's one of those guys that keeps staging elections, and they're not really free and fair elections. So pretty much that's not a threatening place to him. He's got control of Belarus. And then, of course, there's this huge country of Ukraine. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe except Russia. It's larger than any other European country. Russia's number one. Ukraine is number two. It's a very significantly large country. This is the Baltic states. These are the countries that right now are very, very nervous. These were the first three. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the first three to break away when the Soviet Union began to collapse, when we had glasnost and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, remember, in the 1989 to 1991 corridor, and there was all of, Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall and all that stuff. So it was a really... those countries right now are very concerned about what's happening. This is the Asian part of Russia, and you all know that part of our conversation about the situation we're in right now very much involves China as well. Putin has been collaborating and has gotten sort of tacit permission from the Chinese government to proceed with some of the things he's doing. Okay, brief history of Ukraine. And I'm just trying to highlight some very important things. So it's actually very, very ancient in terms of human occupation. They've got evidence of civilization, human civilizations. They're going back 32,000 years BC, which is pretty amazing. They were tribal. There were Slavic tribes and Norse and Varangian tribes that occupied prior to the 9th century. Not a lot of records from that time, obviously. And then you had this period called Kievan Rus. And you've actually heard Putin evoking memories, historical memories of Kievan Rus in his justification for what he's done. And of course, it's, not a justification. But Kiev used to be the capital of what was the closest thing to early Russian borders. And it was a period from 879 AD to 1240 AD. It was mainly tribal, and there was Baltic and Finnic and Eastern Slavic peoples. It fell when the Mongols invaded in 1240. And then you had a period where really kind of your first, totalitarian or authoritarian leader, Vladimir the Great, rose to power. And he was actually critically important to the culture that developed in both Russia and Ukraine. He was a ruler of this, kind of warring tribal peoples, and knowing that the people they were largely pagan, idol worshippers, they were doing sacrifices and rituals. He kind of saw it as being not healthy for his nation that he was trying to form. And he actually said, we need a better religion. He actually treated it like a commodity and said, we're going to go shopping for a better way. And he literally sent his mother out. This is I loved this story. I wrote a paper on this in college. He sent his mother out to go visit places, and then he went and visited places. And they rejected Judaism because Judaism, they were the chosen people, but they got booted out of their home country, so that can't be any good. And then there was Islam, and they looked at that and they said, no, I can't do, they've got all of these weird prohibitions and attitudes. They didn't like that. They looked at Roman Catholicism and decided it was too boring, literally. And then he sent his mom to see Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia, the Orthodox, the Eastern Rite Catholic Orthodox Christian church. And she saw beautiful ritual and very meaningful culture. And they said, that's it. That's what we're going to become. And they literally looked at all of their different religious options and chose Orthodox Christianity, transported that back, and that is how all of the Slavic and Eastern European nations became Orthodox. That is the truth. So Vladimir the Great is the one that brought, and you can see in Kiev, his cathedral, and there is a icon of him being baptized and in the Orthodox faith, and you can see that in Kiev today, and God willing it will stay intact, right? I kept saying, watching the news last week, I was just like, no, not the churches, please, not the churches. Anyway, so then the Mongols invaded, that kind of all fell apart. 600 years of battling between various controls of different Austro-Hungarian, Polish-Lithuanian, the Ottoman Turks, the Muscovite dukes. Then there was the Catherine the Great Tsardom that began in Russia, and that was a period of some stability. And I'm kind of skipping, fast-forwarding to some highlight things. 1917 was the Russian Revolution, and Ukraine became the People's Republic of Ukraine, or the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic under Lenin. Another major highlight event historically that is key, I think, to what's happening now is the Chernobyl disaster. Many of us will remember in 1986. It's the largest nuclear accident we've ever had globally. It's still dangerous. It's still emitting radiation. It's still possibly, with the Russians that are now operating it, I've heard they're not maintaining it very well, and it needs maintenance, and it could become dangerous again. So that's a major player in this conversation. In 1989, Gorbachev came to power. He was open to glasnost and reform. That's when the people of Germany took down the Berlin Wall and said, we want to end this, and so Germany reunites. And by 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and Ukraine became an independent nation again. And pro-Russian leaders were installed, but at least they were an independent nation. And so things were sort of copacetic for a while, but largely there was Russian puppets there. Is that fair to say? And this is when you were growing up there, right? You were born in 91. Wow. Okay. So I'm going to let you take over from here. So the biggest problem is that once they finally had a non-pro-Russian leader elected, in 2013 and 2014, the Russian-backed separatists, they've been fighting for about 8 or 9 years on the east side of Ukraine and in the Donbass. And Putin went ahead and illegally annexed Crimea for the geographic reasons that we already talked about. And there was this thing that they called it the Revolution of Dignity, or the Euromaidan revolt, which is a region where they held this protest where they wanted to have non-pro-Russian leadership. They wanted to have an election that was free and fair, and they finally did. And then that was when Zelensky was elected. And he had actually played a president in he was an actor, you heard he was an actor, and he had played the president in a movie. And so he ran and he got elected. He's turning out to doing a very good job. And then we know that as of February 24th, just a matter of days ago, Putin invaded. So I want to just highlight a couple of other things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kateryna. There was this amazing demonstration of who the Ukrainian people are that I wanted to highlight for you. At the height of this sort of transition away from communism in Europe, when the Berlin Wall had come down, when the Soviet Union was starting to maybe fall apart, the people of Ukraine got together and formed a human chain on January 21st, 1990, that went from the entire city of Ukraine all the way to Lviv. So it was maybe, to drive it is almost 7.5 hours long. And it's, hundreds and hundreds of miles. And they formed this human chain. Do you remember anything about that? You were a baby. You're not born yet. Okay, this is before you were born. But I think this is this just gives you a small window into the strength of the Ukrainian people, who they are. They are the second largest nation in Europe, and I put this map up here to show you that if you put Ukraine inside the United States, just so you could get a sense, it would stretch from Chicago to New York and from Toronto to Raleigh. So it's pretty big country, okay? And I wanted to give you guys that sense of that. And you can see its proximity to the Black Sea. The Crimea, of course, has already been annexed. These are the regions of Ukraine. It has a lot of rural areas, right? And hopefully Kateryna can tell you more about that. One of the other major players in this whole situation politically right now is NATO. And the fact that after World War II, and after we defeated Hitler in a partnership with Stalin, it was Churchill and Stalin and FDR taking on Hitler. And once we defeated him, there was this dividing up of Europe, if you will. The countries that were allied primarily with the United States and with Great Britain formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And as you can see now, NATO is a huge part of the world, in the dark blue over there, including Colombia in South America has just joined NATO, which is pretty amazing. But it is significant, and this is, of course, been Putin's rationale all along, is that this is a threat to him. There's a thing called Article 5, and Article 5 is a requirement to sign into NATO. You have to agree that if any inch of territory of any NATO nation is threatened, that you will fight to defend it. So everyone that signs on to this agreement is committing their precious blood to defend every other nation in the treaty pact. And that's the power of NATO. NATO countries currently, there are 30 members, and originally there was only 12. There are some European nations that are neutral by constitutional requirements: Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, and Ireland, because Ireland refused to join unless all of Ireland could join. And Ireland, as you know, is divided still by the British. So those are some nations that are not in it. And this is the last thing I'm going to do. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why we now have a war in Ukraine. Make no doubt about this, friends. This is a war of one man. This is not a war against the Russian people. I love the Russian people, and I love the Ukrainian people. And I don't believe for a second that any of them want this. This is his war, and we can, I'll talk later about the speculation about what his mental state is. But I wanted to just really briefly highlight a couple things about Putin, okay? Because this is his war. And please, if you hear of any people, I've heard that there's been threats against Russian tea rooms in Chicago. People have made death threats against Russians that are living in Chicago. So please, I know we will all in this church be a voice for peace and pointing out that they are not the enemy, okay? This is not Russia's war, this is Putin's war, okay? Putin was born in 1952 in St. Petersburg. He went to law school. He was a foreign intelligence officer for the KGB, stationed in East Germany. He retired, went back to the university, and then he became an advisor to the mayor of St. Petersburg. He was then put on to, when the Soviet Union dissolved, he moved into Moscow. He was put onto presidential staff as a sort of an administrator in the Kremlin, which is the whole huge capital complex in Moscow. In 1998, Boris Yeltsin appointed him head of the Federal Security Service and named him ultimately prime minister. And you all may remember Boris Yeltsin was kind of the, man that was supposed to take Russia to freedom, we had hoped. He was the one that really helped to dismantle the Soviet Union between Gorbachev transferring authority ultimately to Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a hope for freedom, but Yeltsin was also an alcoholic. And he really was a bad alcoholic, and he really was not able to sustain the ability to lead. And frankly, I know alcoholism. When I was in Russia in 1978, I was told that 1/3 of every Russian was alcoholic. I was told that was a huge problem there. That fetal alcohol syndrome, the pregnant women, that this was a huge problem, and so on. So this was, a common thing. But Yeltsin eventually fell apart, and Putin more and more began to act on his behalf. Ultimately, he is named acting president. So he came to power actually by around the year 2000, but he was only supposed to have like 2 short terms of office, and he kept engineering these questionable elections in terms of how, whether or not they were really as legitimate, was there ballot stuffing, they just had to trust the results of the elections. There was really some serious, after the first election, it seemed he legitimately won because he was strong and Yeltsin was kind of falling apart and he was going to really do a competent job. But in the end, Putin really did force a big crackdown on any opposition, started arresting people. You've seen it happening in the last 2 weeks, arresting anybody at home that disagreed with him, poisoning people, literally. Horrible poisons of people that would betray him, people that were even working for other governments that were, he was poisoning people in England. He has poisoned and jailed his major opposition candidate. So he has now declared, this happened just this year, he actually changed the Constitution so he can be president for life. He kept saying that there would be, elections coming up and he'd have to eventually, be term limited out of office, but that's not going to happen now. So he's basically admitted he's going to be a dictator. And so it's been downhill from there. So the last thing I'm going to do before I turn it over to you, because you're wearing your Ukrainian flag, Kateryna, is I just wanted to say something about how much I love your beautiful flag. Because I, as a social studies teacher, I just really like that. And I thought I would tell you, I found this picture. This is really why the Ukrainian flag is what it is, right? Can you see? Isn't that a beautiful thing? The sky blue and the beautiful gold fields. This is Kateryna's hometown, Nikolaev. Did I say that correctly? And I got some pictures of it. And that map of where the Russian troops are is actually from yesterday's news. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you my dear friend Katarina Bilashopka, who I have known now for about 5 years, and I'm really glad that you're willing to come. I'm just going to say one more thing, which is this is a very traumatic time for her with her mom and grandmom there. So we're not going to talk about her family. We're just going to let her talk about, yes, what is happening.
All right. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to read because I'm really nervous. And all right. Okay, good evening. My name is Kateryna, and I'm a proud Ukrainian. I'm from the city of Nikolaev. First, I want to thank you all for coming and showing your support for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Well, there is no words to describe how I feel about this evil. This person doesn't deserve forgiveness. What he is doing to the people of Ukraine is sinful. From the beginning of the war, the official number of children who were killed is 90. More than 100 is injured. 379 schools were bombed. 59 of them were destroyed in total. One of those terrible days, the maternity hospital in the city of the Mariupol was bombed while pregnant women were there. They are starving people to death, destroying humanitarian aid cars with red crosses on it. He's trying to make it seem that they're the ones who are trying to help Ukrainian people with food and water, but are targeting Ukrainian cars with the supplies. He brainwashed Russian people with his own news, so they all think that he is doing the right thing, saving Ukraine from Nazis. Can you imagine and believe he says that we are Nazis? Beautiful country that has been independent with great people in it are the Nazis. Meanwhile, he's the terrorist with no heart and no soul. Children are dying because of dehydration, because this evil man one day decided to play his war games. I want to say how proud am I for Ukrainian people for standing their ground. Those people are actually stopping tanks with bare hands. They would rather die than let Putin to destroy our country and our people. I'm proud to be Ukrainian, and what he is doing to us will not go unpunished. I hope you all keep in Ukraine in your thoughts and prayers. If you have or going to donate for Ukraine, I want to thank you on the behalf of the whole of all of the Ukrainian people. Together we can make it. Together we can make a change. There is a saying in Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, Heroim Slava, which translates in English as glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Thank you all for being here today and showing your support.
That's right. I've got too many things. I'm going to have you take your glass. Thank you. I'm scripted. I have a tendency to ramble. I don't want to do that. I stopped wearing. Is this working? It's good. You have to go closer. Okay. Maybe I'll hold it. I stopped wearing mascara 2 weeks ago. There's not much more that I can say to convince you all of the severity of this situation, especially for children. Pandemics, war, you simply cannot overstate the devastating impact that these things will have on an entire generation of children in Ukraine and beyond. So I thought long and hard about what I should do with this opportunity. And I think the question on all of your minds is, what can we do? The short answer I've come up with is, do something. So much for the short answer. The fact is, doing something is difficult given the complexity of the challenges currently facing people in Ukraine and the surrounding countries. And the logistics. Have y'all tried to have a sofa delivered or buy your favorite cereal in the past 12 months? That's here on the North Shore. Now with that in mind, imagine trying to get supplies from Chicago into Ukraine. I do not want to disparage anyone's well-intended individual efforts to serve, but I can assure you that you are not in a better position to get warm blankets into the hands of people in Ukraine than the UN High Commission for Refugees. Last week, a donor shared with me how she initially thought the most efficient thing to do was to get weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians. And I think we can all sort of sympathize with that. And she was in the process of acquiring cryptocurrency when it occurred to her that others might be better suited to the task. That's a true story. Please let the professionals do their work. How? Once again, the simplest answer is the best. Send money. If you are like me, you believe that how we spend our money is the highest expression of our values. And there is no better way to stand with the people of Ukraine right now than to support the professionals with hundreds of years of combined experiences working in conflict zones. Now, it would be dishonest for me to stand up here as a long-term UNICEF supporter and pretend that I don't think of all of these organizations I'm going to speak about in just a minute, that giving to UNICEF isn't the highest and best use of your funds at this time. So let's get to the why. As you likely know, Roughly half of the more than 2 million refugees who have fled Ukraine are children. Many of them are unaccompanied by their primary caregiver. And unaccompanied children on the move present unique challenges, and UNICEF is there, protecting children from exploitation and abuse until they are safely delivered back into the arms of their parents or other relatives. Logistics. After many years of vaccinating the world's children, we are the undisputed logistics champions. Nobody reaches more kids in more hard-to-reach places than UNICEF. And we have been on the ground in Ukraine for many years already. As you learned from Jennifer's presentation, in eastern Ukraine, children and families have been suffering the effects of armed conflict for 8 years already. And UNICEF has been right there with them, providing access to essential services like water, sanitation, and hygiene, helping them to continue their education, and working to contain the heightening risks of measles we don't even think about in the of diseases we don't even think about in the United States, like measles. Scale. Donors often ask me how they can be sure their money is being put to good use. The UN is just so big and bureaucratic. And while I believe that there are two sides to everything, in this case, the thing that scares you, the sheer magnitude of our operations, is how you should know we are the best equipped to do this complex job. As an example, last week we delivered 62 tons of supplies to Ukraine from UNICEF's Global Supply and Logistics Hub in Copenhagen. We buy in bulk and we negotiate the best pricing. So for example, $6 buys a blanket. $55 buys a course of therapeutic food that's 150 packets, and it can save a hungry child's life. $188 provides a school in a box that keeps 40 children and a teacher engaged in activities for 3 months. I could go on and on, but I promise to be brief. So, on to cooperation. And that's where I get into my slide here. There's more than one reputable organization doing life-saving work in Ukraine, and I want to dispel the notion that this is some kind of tragedy Olympics. To contextualize this a bit, I thought I'd share this slide. It's how the constellation of reputable humanitarian aid organizations respond to a crisis. They work together and they stay in their own lanes. Some lead on health and others lead on telecommunications, shelter, and nutrition. The people of Ukraine would be well served by your donations to any one of these organizations. So please give early and give often. But even here in Kenilworth, eventually the money runs out. All of us have a finite amount of resources to share. Thank you for your generosity. But then what is to be done? Getting back to my theme of how you can help, another thing you can do is advocate. Share the information you've heard tonight with your networks, or give them my contact info, and I would be happy to speak with them. The children of the world urgently need your help. Finally, if you've given money and you've raised your voice, there's still one more thing you can do. And it's something all of you can do as much as you want. And that's to pray. Pray for peace. James Elder at UNICEF said succinctly last week, this conflict has to stop. The missiles have to stop. But as Christians, we know that the peace which Christ brings and promises is very different from the peace which the world can give or take, win or lose. So I ask you to please remember the people of Ukraine in your prayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Kateryna. And thank you, Jennifer, for being here. If you all are okay, we have some time for questions. In order for the people online to hear the questions, it's most helpful if I pass this microphone around, and then you all can decide who answers at this microphone. So are there any questions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and that was very, very informative. You talked about peace, and the question is there a negotiated solution that you could see that would make sense in the context of the geography and the population demographics that you know of?
I mean, I'll tell you that if he could have the Donbass, I bet you they'd give it to him. I mean, I would like to know what you think, Kateryna, but I've actually heard quite a few people say that, you know, if you look at the map, and I have to go back, if you look at where they have, this map only shows the southeastern corner, but as you know, he's been lining basically around, because Kyiv is not even in this slide, right? But he has been securing the warm water port stuff, absolutely top priority. And he already took Crimea, and pretty much people, I mean, acknowledged it was illegal, it was horrible, but they kind of let it go because they realized that they couldn't fight for that. I think that, and the Donbass is this eastern part that actually touches the Russian border. I think that you know, there is hope for, you know, possible territorial. I don't want to speak for them. I just know that they're talking about, you know, what does he want? He doesn't want NATO on his borders, and he doesn't, and that's why Ukraine has never joined NATO. Because they knew it would be a provocative action. Do you want to think about? You don't have any ideas about what could be solutions? No, I don't. Okay. Anybody else?
I just want to know: is there a direct? Oh, I don't. Is there a direct place we can send, not just to UNICEF, but can you put that on the board or anywhere so we can send a check immediately to a certain place?
Yes. So a couple ways to answer that question. If you want to give through if you want to give to UNICEF through Kenilworth Union Church, we have a link that we've established just for us. And so I think what we'll probably do is send out a follow-up email. And then I can provide that list of other organizations that we talked about. And, you know, that I think is the most expeditious way. All these organizations are, they only do one thing. There's not, you know, it's, I think that's the simplest answer. If you want to send it in Chicago, again, you can also just contact me and I can get it to our offices here. Whatever works. We have a lot of modalities.
I'll say one more thing. And I hope you can comment on this. There are significant, I did hear on the news, and only on the news, I don't have any other information about it, that the United States was supposed to be fast-tracking refugees coming here that had American connections. So in other words, if they had family here in Ukraine, from Ukraine, they could come here if they had family here. And so I don't know if that's happened. I think every one of us needs to, I've heard that it's not happening as fast as it should for the refugee crisis. As you know, Poland announced this morning that they are literally, I mean, they've taken everybody, they've taken everybody unconditionally, and they are now literally, they just said this morning, our infrastructure is falling apart because they just don't have enough room for everybody. So it's 2.5 million people, I heard, as of today. Yeah, 3 million. Yeah, and in Hungary as well, but Hungary's not getting as many as Poland is. So I know that one of the things we've been told is that the people here that are trying to help on the computer, trying to do the State Department paperwork and stuff to help the refugees to get here, that they are not able to get into the sites as the way that they should. So every one of us could call our state representative, I mean our congressional, or our congresswomen, and Jan Schakowsky or whoever you're in, and our state senators, Durbin and Duckworth, and tell them to get this fast tracking thing done. And that way anybody that is a Ukrainian refugee that did manage to get out can get to, if they have American connections, that they can get here as easily as possible.
You pretty much said everything. Yeah.
You want to say anything more about that? Okay. Here, let me go.
Just a quick question on the role of UNICEF. I know they're taking a huge load of the work with helping with the refugees who've left Ukraine. Can you speak to what efforts they're able to do within Ukraine, given the situation? I mean, are they ready to go in as soon as they can go in? Or are they on the ground?
We're in.
What can you speak to what they're able to do?
Yeah. So first, just as we were talking just now, I was thinking about how I really want to emphasize that UNICEF is in Ukraine and it's in all of the neighboring countries. So this huge migration of people into, it's not like they get to Poland and we're like, oh, this is a Ukraine crisis. That piece is being addressed. In terms of what we're doing in country, UNICEF leads in 2 areas, although at this point, everyone's doing everything. But we lead on water, sanitation, and hygiene. So something that's longstanding in Ukraine, so not just since February 24th, is a lot of their infrastructure is in really bad shape. And so access to things like clean water is not very good. And so we've had that role in the country already, especially in that eastern section, for many years already. In addition, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in pre-COVID in Ukraine. And so they have a lot of diseases there that we don't think of as being modern diseases. So we've seen polio, we've seen measles, things that we just don't think are even active anywhere in the world anymore. But so there's that active drive to continue to immunize. We have 4 country offices. They are all currently open because of our role with the UN. I'm not going to try to explain the legal aspects of this, but it's hard to operate in a conflict zone. And because we are part of the UN, we are protected. So I don't know that there's a lot of fairness or logic in anything that Putin is directing at the moment, but theoretically they have all the coordinates of these humanitarian sites, and they're not supposed to use them, or they're supposed to use them to not attack those spaces. And as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, that hasn't necessarily held, but so far all of our staff have been safe. We're educating kids, and again, that child protection piece is really huge. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but something I don't think I realized until I started doing this work is that there are just some bad actors who wait for these circumstances and prey on kids. So it's like we say, look for the helpers, and it's like there are people who will pose as helpers and then exploit kids. So that's a big component of our operation as well. Does that answer your question? I can go on, but
Let me see. Sorry. Did you have a question? And then I'll go to you. Okay.
I just wondered I know that supporting outreach, we do Refugee One. I would like to know what other organizations work together with Refugee One, so that how can we find out more about who these people are and when they're coming here?
I can try to speak to that a little bit. So to the best of my knowledge, as of today, we haven't seen any of these refugees yet in the United States. However, when they do get here, many of them will end up in Chicago because we have a preponderance of really reputable organizations doing great work. And Refugee One is one of them. Heartland is one of them. And again, much like as I described in active conflict zones, most of these organizations work very well together. So I would expect that they are poised and ready. One thing I was hesitant to mention in my remarks before, but I think you all can imagine is true, we were already managing a refugee crisis here with so many people coming from Afghanistan and then Central America. And so these organizations are stretched really thin already. So they're going to need all hands on deck. And that is a place where if you want to do a clothing drive or you want to, collect money for iPads or books or whatever, that I think once those people arrive here, there's not going to be any shortage of opportunities for that kind of work. Is that good?
I just want to add something that I heard. This UCCA Illinois, which is Ukrainian Central Committee, it's anyway, uccaillinois.org it's a national Ukrainian cultural support group that also it connects Ukrainian people in the United States, and they have an Illinois chapter, and they're based here. And we were also sending them a little bit. Love for Dogs was collecting money and sending it to them to help them. But they are telling us the exact same thing that I'm really already worried about, which is that while I heard on the news that they're supposed to be making it easy to try to process these people through as quickly as possible, when they're going to the website, nothing is happening. Nothing. And that has got to be, and this lady from UCCA told me, please tell everybody to call their congressman and call their senators and tell them to get the website working now. Okay.
They are responsible for the website. What is the website?
State Department. State Department. Yeah.
So I really appreciated your slide where you looked at different organizations and what different roles organizations play in any kind of crisis management, especially during conflict. We're very well aware of the refugee crisis. I think we have experience with refugees from different countries, and our heart really bleeds for those people. But my heart is really going out to the people who are trapped in the Ukraine right now, and who are fighting for their lives and fighting for their country and their independence. All of the people who not only are trapped, but the people who volunteered to stay back. And so my question is, how do we get the necessary supplies to the people who are still in the Ukraine, who are on the ground, not only the food and supplies that they need, but also the equipment that they need for fighting to protect themselves, the medical trauma equipment to save lives of soldiers. Who's handling those kind of needs?
So I can only speak to the humanitarian aid side of things. I don't know how to get guns to Ukraine. I wish I did. You can, maybe.
No, I can't get guns there either, but I'd like to. But what Joan's been saying is, you have a lot of organizations there. You have infrastructure there. What she's speaking about is something that we've been involved in. We're trying to get ballistic helmets, body armor, two-way comms, and we're trying to get trauma equipment and dressings to volunteers on the ground in Ukraine so that they can help the wounded. Who can we talk to within that umbrella of organizations maybe to help get us a hand up on that so we can get this equipment to the right people? And if this is a question we could talk about offline, that's fine.
Yeah, I think we absolutely can. And I think I'm all about the short answer. The best follow-up, I think, is probably in an email with links and whatnot. So all of those organizations lead on different things. So if you're talking about telecommunications, that's not UNICEF. There's a different organization that's doing that. So we can talk about that. If you're talking about sort of the food security piece, the World Food Program, I think, is doing extraordinary work worldwide, but specifically all of these people are on the ground in Ukraine, specifically responding to this conflict. So while the refugee needs are huge, there's the folks who are in place in Ukraine haven't been forgotten by any of these people either. The challenges in whether or not their, convoy is bombed or, those are things we can't control for, obviously. But so far that hasn't been an issue. And like I said, because many of these organizations have already been on the ground in Ukraine for many years already, the infrastructure is there. And so I think I'll send that list in a follow-up email rather than listing them all off. And hopefully, I think all of the needs except for the munitions can be addressed by folks on that list, depending on what your interest is.
I would just add that if there's anything military that you want to see happen, you should call your congressman.
No, this isn't. See, that's the thing. This isn't military. The helmets and
Yeah, it's more.
armor.
Yeah.
It's specifically to protect these workers so they can evacuate wounded civilians and be able to get them aid. So, but people, they hear helmets, they hear body armor, they think it's military aid. It's not.
It's for the volunteer
Yeah,
contact
that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
And to Kateryna Biloshapka.
Heroям слава.
Well, I want to be mindful of our time, but maybe you're willing to stay around if people have some additional questions for one-on-one conversations. Let's please thank Kateryna and Jennifer and Hillary. Thank you so much for a very good presentation.
I'd be happy to give a copy of my PowerPoint to anybody that needs it to explain it to anybody else. I'm serious.
I want it.
Thank you, Kenilworth Union Church.